International trade in Timbuktu often needed written contracts. That required the services of scribes and notaries, and they needed to work in a common language that bridged frontiers. Arabic spread across Africa in the wake of Islam, just as Christianity spread Latin across the European continent. So it's for good reason, then, that historians call Arabic the Latin of Africa. In the wake of Islam, another commodity began to arrive with the camel trains. Books were soon being traded in Timbuktu's marketplaces as wealthy merchants found a new indulgence for their deep pockets and leisure time. Books greatly enhanced the status of their owners and gave the pious a deeper understanding of Islam. The profits of the book trade soon rivaled the trade in gold, salt and slaves. By the end of the 13th century, the prominent families of Timbuktu began to boast their own libraries, and the sons of those families aspired not just to trade, but to scholarship. Paper was imported from Europe and China, and a new occupation swelled the ranks of the city's workforce. Calligraphers started copying Islamic texts from abroad, as well as the work of the town's own scholars. Their labours were impressively rewarded.
If I was working back in the 15th century, I'd be earning millions. I'd have many houses, many camels, and lots of gold. You'd get many people ordering manuscripts back then, and they'd pay in gold, they'd pay in camels. They'd even exchange their houses in order to acquire manuscripts. It's a very different story today, and nowadays, I'm amongst the poorest people in the town, and I'm still the only person in the town practicing this craft.
Towards the end of the 13th century, Ghana was overtaken by the Malian Empire, and Timbuktu became the commercial hub of this new superpower. The fabulously wealthy Muslim ruler of the Malian Empire, Kanka Musa, made his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, stopping in Timbuktu in acknowledgement of the city's economic and cultural importance.
Kanka Musa was the greatest emperor of West Africa. He was a very religious man, very pure. He went with a huge retinue of men and women on his Hajj to Mecca. He took 15 tons of gold with him and distributed it so generously in Egypt and Mecca that the price of gold collapsed.
News of the splendour and spending power that marked Kanka Musa's progress through Egypt and Syria soon reached the ears of merchants around the Mediterranean. Within 50 years of Musa's pilgrimage, the Majorcan cartographer Abraham Cresques had drawn a map for the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne, showing a black African monarch on a golden throne, and Timbuktu as the capital of Mali. The legend of a desert El Dorado had gripped European minds. Kanka Musa brought Arabic professors back from Mecca to boost Timbuktu's scholarship, though it's said they proved to be no match for the city's own black African scholars. He also commissioned new buildings to grace Timbuktu, including a palace. Any sign of Kanka Musa's palace, which it said once stood somewhere here, have long since disappeared. The palace was designed for the king by the Andalusian architect Es-Saheli, who Kanka Musa brought back from his pilgrimage to Mecca. When the palace fell into disuse, the site became an abattoir, but one magnificent remnant of Kanka Musa's legacy remains. The Djinguereber Mosque was also designed by Es-Saheli. It's been added to and repaired over 600 years, but it still represents a startling, almost futuristic vision, utterly different from my idea of a mosque. Impressive as it is now, back then Kanka Musa's mosque would have awed the people of Timbuktu, just as Europe's mighty cathedrals left their congregations in no doubt as to where the power lay. The imam guided me around the mosque's deceptively spacious interior.
We are in the second prayer aisle of the mosque, and there are 9 of them in all, each about 100 meters long. When you look from the outside, you get the impression that the mosque is not very large. But when you come inside, you see that it's actually huge. And when you come into the mosque too, you get the impression that it's air-conditioned. The architects made it in such a way to stop the heat from getting inside, because the mud brick is a bad conductor of heat. So the mosque always has the temperature of the early morning.
Scholarship as much as trade was to drive Timbuktu's reputation. Timbuktu's scholars were avid in their pursuit of knowledge in every field. Knowledge was highly respected in the Islamic world, and those possessing it won prestige and power. With its professors and their prolific writings, Timbuktu was set to become the region's most important centre of learning. Ibn Battuta, the great Moroccan world traveller who voyaged as far as China and ancient Mali, visited Timbuktu in the 14th century. In his chronicles, he noted his impressions of the city, in particular the piety, tolerance, wisdom and justice of its inhabitants.
You had so many books coming from Arabia, and because the people of Timbuktu had digested so much Islam, they were able to give it real meaning and accessibility for the people. Because of Timbuktu's mastery of Islam, it has always strived towards an Islam with great tolerance.
The daily activity of Timbuktu's scholars revolved around its 3 mosques. The Sankore Mosque is said to have been built in the 14th century by a wealthy Tuareg woman. Together with 2 other mosques, the Sidi Yahia and the Jingareber, they comprised what became known as Sankore University. The Sankore's rise was marked by an expanding scholastic community whose intellectual musings rapidly filled the libraries. It also signalled Timbuktu's golden age, ushered in during the last decades of the 15th century by yet another turn in the cycle of West African empires. The Songhai Empire was the most powerful yet. Its creator, Soni Ali Bear, reigned from his capital Gao over a landmass greater than Western Europe. Nominally a Muslim, Soni was also a champion of African traditions. He refused to allow his culture to be subsumed by Islam. If Timbuktu's scholars weren't willing to play to his tune, he soon let them know who was boss.
The scholars and those in charge of the religious principles had to obey Soni. Otherwise, he would get rid of them. When he arrived in Timbuktu in January 1468, the scholars got scared and many fled to other towns and cities.
But Soni Ali Bear was also a visionary and an idealist, a leader who today's historians might hail as the continent's first Pan-Africanist.
Soni was a great visionary too. He wanted a united Africa, and furthermore, everywhere he conquered, he imposed his own language. For him, unity is the means of communication and a common language.
The emperors who succeeded Soni were more devoutly Muslim, encouraging Timbuktu scholarship and subsidizing its professors. By the mid-1500s, the city's size and population eclipsed that of many European capitals, and the Sankore University was recognized as West Africa's preeminent center of Islamic knowledge. Sankore's graduates partied all through the 16th century. But in 1591, a cataclysmic event shattered Timbuktu's scholastic idyll and destroyed the stability of the Songhai Empire for good.
The Moroccans came here to fight the Songhai. and they took over Timbuktu. Then they destroyed the university and deported most of the scholars back to Morocco along with all the manuscripts they could find. And that is how the university disappeared.
But the Moroccan invasion was just one factor in Timbuktu's decline. By then, the shifting focus of European trade from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic was already depressing the fortunes of the whole region.
West Africa was always going to lose the battle. Why? Because the demand for African gold fell at the beginning of the 15th century. Europe was then buying its gold and precious metals from America.
With the camel trains, books were soon being traded in Timbuktu's marketplaces as wealthy merchants found a new indulgence for their deep pockets and leisure time. Books greatly enhanced the status of their owners and gave the pious a deeper understanding of Islam, inspired not just to trade, but to scholarship. Paper was imported from Europe and China, and a new occupation swelled the ranks of the city's workforce. Calligraphers started copying Islamic texts from abroad. Africa in the wake of Islam, just as Christianity spread Latin across the European continent. So it's for good reason, then, that historians call Arabic the Latin of Africa. In the wake of Islam, another commodity began to arrive. International trade in Timbuktu often needed written contracts. That required the services of scribes and notaries, and they needed to work in a common language that bridged frontiers. Arabic spread across. The profits of the book trade soon rivaled the trade in gold, salt and slaves. By the end of the 13th century, the prominent families of Timbuktu began to boast their own libraries, and the sons of those families